The patrol car felt like a cage, a hot, humming box rolling through streets that no longer seemed to belong to him. Officer Riddle stared out through the dusty windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 15 years. 15 years he'd put into this job, this city. He'd chased down suspects, broken up fights, pulled bodies from wrecks. He'd done it all. And for what? To be treated like some kind of villain? To have every move he made second-guessed by some kid with a phone camera? To have every report filed scrutinized by bosses who cared more about headlines than about the men and women on the street? The world had gone soft, and it had left him behind. He saw it everywhere. The way people looked at him when he drove by, not with respect, not with the gratitude of a citizen protected, but with suspicion, with a kind of quiet challenge. It was worse in the neighborhoods that were changing, the ones where old storefronts were being replaced by trendy cafes. He couldn't afford him faces that didn't look like the ones he grew up with. They didn't trust him. They didn't need him. And that, more than anything, ate away at the core of who he thought he was. His radio crackled with a burst of static and a dispatcher's voice, calling out a code for a shoplifting incident across town. Riddle didn't bite. Let someone else handle it. He was on his own personal patrol today, a tour of his own diminishing kingdom. He turned down a side street, a tree-lined avenue of modest brick houses. It was quiet. Too quiet. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a mistake. That's when he saw it. A black sedan, a few years old, clean and well-kept. It approached a stop sign at the end of the block. Riddle watched, his eyes narrowing. The car's wheels barely paused. It was what they called a California roll, a slow, rolling stop that wasn't a full legal stop. It was nothing. The kind of thing 99 out of 100 cops would let slide. But Riddle wasn't in a forgiving mood. Here was an opportunity, a small one, but an opportunity nonetheless. A chance to remind someone who was in charge, a chance to feel, for just a moment, like the world was still the way it was supposed to be. He flicked on his lights and siren, not a long blare, just a quick whoop to get the driver's attention. The sedan pulled over immediately, smoothly hugging the curb. Perfect. Textbook. Riddle parked behind it, angling his car to block the lane. He took a deep breath, the familiar ritual calming his frayed nerves. He ran a hand over his buzz cut, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, and saw a stranger staring back, a tired, angry man with hard eyes. He pushed the thought away and opened his door. The afternoon sun was warm on his neck as he walked to the driver's side window. His hand rested near his sidearm, not because he expected trouble, but because it was part of the uniform, part of the posture of authority. He peered inside. The driver was a black man, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans. He looked neat, clean-cut. He had both hands on the top of the steering wheel, exactly where they were supposed to be. His face was calm, almost neutral. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look scared. He just looked patient. This immediately annoyed Riddle. "License and registration," Riddle said. His voice was flat, all business. He made no effort to be friendly. "Of course, officer," the man replied. His voice was smooth, even. He reached slowly, deliberately, for his wallet, then leaned over to the glove compartment for the registration. Every movement was controlled, measured. He handed the documents to Riddle. Riddle took them, his eyes scanning the man's face, looking for a flicker of something: fear, resentment, anything. There was nothing. Just that same unnerving calm. He looked at the driver's license. James Carter. The name meant nothing to him. He looked back at the man, at the way he held himself. There was a confidence there that Riddle didn't like. It felt like arrogance. It felt like this man thought he was better than him. "You know why I stopped you today, sir?" Riddle asked, leaning down a little, trying to impose himself, to fill the space with his presence. "I assume I didn't come to a complete stop back there at the sign," Carter said, his eyes forward, still on the road. "If so, I apologize. I was being mindful of the traffic behind me." The apology was too smooth, too reasonable. It wasn't the stammering, "I'm so sorry, officer, it'll never happen again," that Riddle was used to. This felt rehearsed. It felt like a lawyer talking. Riddle's irritation began to curdle into a slow-burning anger. "Mindful of traffic?" Riddle repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There was no traffic. The street was empty. "You just decided the law didn't apply to you for a second there, didn't you?" Carter finally turned his head and looked Riddle in the eye. His gaze was steady, not challenging, but not submissive either. "That was not my intention, officer. I made a mistake in judgment." Riddle stared back at him, his jaw tight. He wanted to break that composure. He wanted to see a crack in that facade. He took the license and registration and walked back to his car, slamming the door a little harder than necessary. He sat there for a moment, his heart thumping. He ran the plates and the license through the computer. Everything came back clean. No warrants, no priors, not even a parking ticket. The car was registered to this same James Carter at a decent address in a good part of town. This made Riddle even angrier. The guy wasn't just some punk off the street. He was a regular citizen, probably with a good job and a nice life. A man who thought he could glide through the world without a care in the world, without a thought for the rules. A man who looked at a cop and saw not an authority figure, but an equal, or worse, an inconvenience. Riddle felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. It was the taste of disrespect. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't just go back there, give him a warning or a ticket, and drive away. That would feel like losing. It would feel like this man had gotten away with it, with his quiet arrogance and his calm defiance. He had to push. He had to find something. He got out of the car and stomped back to the sedan, his mind racing, searching for an angle. He handed the license and registration back through the window. Carter took them without a word. "Step out of the car, sir," Riddle said. His voice was low, a command, not a request. Carter looked at him, a flicker of confusion finally crossing his features. "Officer, is there a problem?" "I said step out of the car." "Now," Riddle repeated, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. Carter paused for a fraction of a second. He seemed to be weighing his options. Then, with a sigh that was almost imperceptible, he opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement. He kept his hands in plain sight. "Am I under arrest?" Carter asked. His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it, a firmness. Riddle's face flushed hot. That question. It was the question they all learned to ask. It was the question that challenged his authority, that put the burden of justification back on him. In that moment, all of Riddle's frustration, all his perceived slights, all his simmering anger at a world that was leaving him behind, it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of rage. This man, this arrogant, disrespectful man, was not going to make a fool of him. Not here. Not now. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the vehicle," Riddle shouted, his voice cracking with fury. Carter froze. "Officer, what is this about? You pulled me over for a traffic violation? You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest?" Riddle yelled, grabbing Carter's arm and twisting it behind his back. He shoved him face first against the car. The move was sudden, violent, and completely out of proportion to the situation. "I am not resisting," Carter said, his voice muffled against the roof of the car. "I am cooperating." Riddle ignored him. He was operating on pure adrenaline now, his training taking over in a way it was never meant to. He wrenched Carter's other arm behind his back and snapped the cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The click of the ratchets locking into place was the loudest sound on the quiet street. He could feel the muscles in Carter's arms tense, but the man didn't struggle. He didn't fight. He just stood there, taking it, which somehow made Riddle even angrier. He spun Carter around and pushed him toward the patrol car. "You have the right to remain silent," Riddle began, reciting the Miranda rights from memory, his voice a harsh, mechanical bark. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he read the words, a part of Riddle's brain, a small, distant part, was screaming at him. "Asterisk? What are you doing? This is wrong. This is insane, asterisk." But he pushed the voice down. He had committed. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He had to see it through. He had to prove that he was the one in control, that his authority was absolute. He shoved Carter into the back of his patrol car, slamming the door shut, enclosing him in the hot, dark cage. Riddle stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around the quiet street. A curtain twitched in a nearby window. Someone had seen. He didn't care. Let them look. Let them see what happened when you didn't show respect. He got back into the driver's seat and looked in the rearview mirror. James Carter was sitting in the back, his posture straight, his face unreadable in the shadows. He wasn't looking at Riddle. He was looking straight ahead. And in that moment, Riddle didn't feel like a winner. He felt hollow. But the humiliation was still there, festering, and he knew he couldn't let it go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Asterisk, the fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed a monotonous tune that drilled into Officer Riddle's skull. He sat in a hard plastic chair in the locker room, staring at the scuffed toes of his boots. The air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, a smell that used to mean home, but now just felt like a cage. The watch commander, a tired-looking man named Evans, with a face full of regret, had let James Carter go an hour ago. No charges. Not even a traffic ticket. Evans had looked at Riddle with a mixture of pity and disappointment before telling him to go home for the rest of his shift. "Mark, what were you thinking?" Evans had asked, his voice low. No priors. A clean record. A witness across the street who said you were the one yelling. The man's a professional, for God's sake. He didn't do a thing wrong, Riddle hadn't answered. What could he say? That the man's calmness felt like a slap in the face. That his politeness was a form of disrespect. It all sounded insane when you said it out loud. So he just nodded, took the reprimand, and walked away, feeling the eyes of every other officer in the building on his back. They didn't see a cop who'd made a mistake in the heat of the moment. They saw a loose cannon, a liability. He could hear the whispers, or at least he imagined he could. Asterisk, that's Riddle. The guy who arrested the accountant for rolling a stop sign? Asterisk, he drove home in a fog of fury. The city lights blurring into streaks of red and white. His apartment was just as he'd left it that morning, neat, sterile, and empty. He couldn't sit. He paced the length of his small living room, the worn carpet doing little to muffle his heavy footsteps. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. Carter's face, his steady voice, the way he'd asked, "Am I under arrest?" That question was a poisoned dart, and it was still lodged in Riddle's pride. It was the question of a man who knew the system, a man who thought he was untouchable. And Riddle had let him walk away. He had been the one to back down. The humiliation of it was a physical thing, a hot, acidic burn in his gut. He couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, seeing Carter's calm, composed face in the shadows. He wasn't just angry. He was obsessed. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was about a war, a silent war for respect, for authority, for the way things were supposed to be. And he had lost the first battle. Badly. The next day, he called his union representative. The rep's name was Dave, a burly guy who always talked about standing up for the blue line. Riddle laid it all out, his voice tight with emotion. He didn't mention the rolling stop. He focused on Carter's attitude, his defiance, the way he'd challenged Riddle's authority on the side of the road. "They just let him go, Dave," Riddle said, pacing again, this time in his kitchen. "They threw me under the bus. The commander didn't even back me up. Now the guys at the precinct, they're looking at me like I'm some kind of racist hothead." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dave sighed, a long, weary sound. "Look, Mark, you know how it is. They're scared of the headlines. One complaint, one video, and they fold. It doesn't matter if you were right. They're not going to risk it. So what am I supposed to do? Just take it." Riddle's voice was rising. Let this guy walk around thinking he can get away with disrespecting a cop. Let him tell his friends that he can just talk his way out of anything? "I'm not saying that," Dave said slowly, and Riddle could hear the gears turning in his head. "I'm just saying the department won't help you. But you have rights too. This man, this Carter, his actions caused you distress. They tarnished your reputation. They made you question yourself on the job. That's not nothing." The idea was a tiny seed, but in the fertile ground of Riddle's anger, it began to sprout. "What are you getting at, Dave?" "I'm just saying. There are other avenues. Legal avenues. You're a victim here too. A victim of a system that doesn't back its own. And a victim of a man who intentionally provoked you. Dave gave him the name of a lawyer, a guy who specialized in cases like this. A guy who understood what cops were going through. The lawyer's office was on the top floor of a downtown building, all dark wood and leather chairs. His name was Steve, and he had a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Riddle sat across the massive desk from him and told his story. As he spoke, he found it easier to bend the truth, to reshape the memory. Carter's calmness became smug arrogance. His reasonable question became a hostile interrogation. Riddle was no longer just a cop who lost his temper. He was a dedicated public servant, psychologically tormented by a citizen's cruel and calculated disrespect. Steve listened intently, nodding along, his pen tapping a silent rhythm on a yellow legal pad. When Riddle was finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair. "Mark," he said, his voice smooth and confident, "what you experienced is a classic case of intentional infliction of emotional distress. This man, Carter, he set out to provoke you. He knew you were a police officer. He knew the pressures you were under, and he used that knowledge to push your buttons, to create a situation where he could then play the victim. His actions have caused you significant psychological harm, anxiety, and have damaged your professional reputation." Riddle felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy. It was true. This man understood. He wasn't crazy. He was a victim. "We can sue him," Steve continued, his eyes gleaming. "We can file a civil suit for defamation of character, for the emotional trauma. We'll make him answer for what he did. We'll show him that he can't treat a police officer like that and just walk away." Over the next few weeks, Riddle worked with Steve to build the case. He wrote a long, detailed statement, and with each word he wrote, he believed the lie more and more. He wasn't just suing Carter. He was fighting back against the whole world that seemed to be against him. He imagined Carter getting the lawsuit papers in the mail. He pictured the look of shock on his face, the fear in his eyes. He would be scared. He was just a regular guy after all. He probably had a family, a mortgage, a job he couldn't afford to lose. He wouldn't have the money or the nerve to fight a lawsuit, especially one from a cop. He would settle. He would apologize. And Riddle would finally have his victory. The day the lawsuit was filed, Riddle felt a sense of power he hadn't felt in years. He walked into the precinct with his head held high. Let them whisper. They didn't know what was coming. He was no longer the victim. He was the one in control. A process server was hired, and Riddle waited for the confirmation. That evening, his phone buzzed. It was Steve. "Papers were served," the lawyer said, his voice crisp. Handed to him directly at his front door. A slow smile spread across Riddle's face. He could almost hear the thud of the thick envelope hitting Carter's floor. He could see the man picking it up, reading the words, his confident facade crumbling into dust. Riddle leaned back on his couch, the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had taken back his power. He had sued the wrong man, but in his mind, he had just made the smartest move of his life. He was completely, utterly, and tragically unaware of the storm he had just summoned. The papers lay on the polished oak of James Carter's home office, an absurdity printed on expensive legal stock. He read them once, then a second time, his brow furrowed, not in fear, but in a kind of academic disbelief. The words seemed to float off the page, disconnected from reality. Asterisk, defamation of character. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Asterisk, the lawsuit claimed that his aggressive and disrespectful behavior had caused Officer Riddle's severe psychological trauma. It was so breathtakingly false, so utterly detached from the memory of that hot afternoon, that it was almost impressive. He leaned back in his leather chair, the chair groaning softly under his weight. The office was his sanctuary, a room lined with law books, diplomas, and a few framed photos of him with colleagues at various legal conferences. It was a space of logic, of precedent, of carefully constructed arguments. This lawsuit was an intruder, a chaotic, nonsensical thing that didn't belong. He felt a flicker of the same annoyance he'd felt on the side of the road, but it was quickly extinguished by a colder, more analytical fire. He thought about the officer, Riddle. He remembered the man's tight, angry face, the way his hands had trembled slightly with rage. He wasn't just a cop having a bad day. He was a man drowning in his own resentment, looking for a life raft. And in his arrogance, he had just thrown a rock at a battleship, thinking it was a piece of driftwood. A slow, deliberate smile touched Carter's lips. This wasn't a problem. This was an opportunity. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived under a pale, washed-out sky. Officer Mark Riddle walked into the courthouse feeling 10 feet tall. He wore his best suit, a dark navy one he usually reserved for funerals. But today, it felt like armor. His lawyer, Steve, walked beside him, already talking strategy in low, confident tones. Riddle wasn't really listening. He was savoring the moment. He imagined Carter, probably a nervous wreck, maybe wearing an ill-fitting suit borrowed from a cousin. He pictured him pacing his living room, terrified of the legal fees of the public exposure, of having to face him in a court of law. They entered the courtroom, a grand, high-ceilinged space with the smell of old wood and floor wax. Riddle chose a bench in the front, his posture relaxed, his legs crossed. He scanned the room, a predator looking for its prey. There were a few other people waiting for their cases to be called. A tired-looking clerk at the front desk, but no sign of Carter. Riddle's smile widened. He was late. Probably couldn't sleep. Good. Where is he? Riddle muttered to Steve, who was shuffling through his files. He'll be here, Steve said, not looking up. He can't afford not to be. We've got him cornered. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The clerk called a different case. Riddle's confidence began to curdle into impatience. What if the guy was a no-show? That would be a victory of a sort, but it would be an empty one. He wanted to see the man's face. He wanted to see him squirm. Just then, a side door near the judge's bench opened. A woman in a sharp, tailored suit entered. She looked to be in her 40s, with a no-nonsense haircut and a confident stride. She was a lawyer. No doubt about it. Riddle watched her, assuming she was there for another case. She walked directly to their table. Are you Steve? She asked, her voice crisp and professional. Steve stood up, a little surprised. I am, and you are. I'm counsel for the defense, she said, extending a hand. Steve shook it, looking confused. Where's your client? Riddle piped up, unable to help himself. Scared to show his face? The woman turned her cool gaze on him for a moment, then looked back at Steve, ignoring the question completely. We're ready to proceed whenever you are. Steve looked around the courtroom again. I don't understand. Where is Mr. Carter? The woman gestured to the man who had followed her into the courtroom and who had been standing quietly behind her until now. He was also wearing a suit, but it was different from Steve's. It was impeccably tailored. It's the kind of suit that costs more than a month's rent. It was the suit of a man who was not just successful, but powerful. He had a confident, composed bearing that was worlds away from the casual man in the polo shirt Riddle had pulled over. Riddle stared at the man. A flicker of recognition in the back of his mind, but he couldn't place him. The man wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Steve, his expression unreadable. Allow me to formally introduce my client, the woman said, a hint of something almost like amusement in her voice. Mr. James Carter, Riddle's lawyer, Steve, looked utterly bewildered. The man we served, he was... The man in the expensive suit stepped forward, extending a hand to Steve. I am James Carter, he said. His voice was the same calm, even voice from the traffic stop, but now it carried an undeniable weight of authority. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being in command. Steve froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked from the man to his client, Riddle, whose face was a mask of confusion. I don't understand, Steve stammered. There's been some kind of mistake. There's no mistake, Carter said, his eyes finally shifting from the lawyer to land on Riddle. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't triumphant. It was worse. It was the look of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. You filed a lawsuit against James Carter of the address you served. That is me. Riddle's world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving it feeling cold and clammy. His heart, which had been thumping with self-satisfied confidence just moments before, now felt like a trapped bird beating against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't the same guy. This was a lawyer, a big-shot lawyer, the kind of guy who walked into courtrooms like he owned them. The woman. Carter's lawyer spoke again, her voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence in the small space between them. Perhaps I should clarify for the record. My client, James Carter, is also an assistant U.S. attorney for the federal district. He prosecutes complex federal cases for a living. And you, she said, her gaze finally fully landing on Riddle, are suing him for a traffic stop. The words hung in the air, each one a tiny, sharp needle piercing Riddle's eardrums. Assistant U.S. attorney, the title echoed in the hollow space of his mind. He wasn't just some guy. He wasn't an accountant or a salesman. He was one of them. He was part of the system, but on a level so far above Riddle, it was like comparing a street cop to the Supreme Court. Riddle looked at Carter. Billy looked at him. The calmness, the composure, the way he had asked, "Am I under arrest?" It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. It wasn't arrogance. It was competence. It wasn't defiance. It was a man who knew his rights and was shocked to see them being trampled on by a rogue officer. The smugness had evaporated, placed by a wave of dawning, all-consuming horror. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to run, to get out of this courtroom.
Ouch.
To rewind the last few weeks and pretend none of this ever happened. He saw the union rep Dave in his mind. He saw the lawyer Steve, confidently telling him they had Carter cornered. They had all been so sure, so blind. They had seen a black man in a modest car and had made 1,000 assumptions, every single one of them wrong. Steve, his face pale and beaded with sweat, was already stammering. "Your Honor, there must be a terrible misunderstanding. We were not aware of. We had no idea." But there was no judge on the bench yet. The only people witnessing Riddle's public execution were the tired clerk and a few bored strangers. Carter's lawyer raised a hand. "There's no misunderstanding. My client was served, he is here, and we are ready to proceed." Or, she paused, letting the silence stretch. "We can adjourn, so you can consult with your client and perhaps reassess the wisdom of this entire action." Riddle couldn't breathe. The courtroom, which had felt like his stage just minutes ago, now felt like a trap. The polished wood seemed to reflect his own pale, terrified face back at him. He looked at Carter, who was watching him with that same unnerving, analytical calm. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge. There was something else, something far more terrifying. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a case on a silver platter. A case that was so perfectly, beautifully flawed that it was practically a gift. And Riddle knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this man was going to dismantle his life, piece by piece. And he was going to do it using the very laws Riddle had sworn to uphold. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped, shattered, and set on fire, and he was standing in the middle of the blaze. The silence in the courtroom was a physical weight, pressing down on Mark Riddle's shoulders until he thought his knees might buckle. It was the kind of silence that follows a sudden, catastrophic event. The stunned quiet of a room where everyone has just witnessed a disaster unfold in slow motion. His lawyer, Steve, was a statue of panic, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no coherent words came out. He was looking at James Carter, but it was a different look now, the look of a predator sizing up prey. But of a man who had just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight. Carter's lawyer. The woman in the sharp suit broke the spell. Her voice was calm, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Given this new information, and the rather significant oversight on the part of the plaintiff, we see no reason to proceed today. We will, of course, be filing a motion to dismiss this frivolous and retaliatory lawsuit with prejudice." And she paused, letting her gaze sweep over Riddle. "We will be exploring our legal options regarding this matter." The words legal options hung in the air, a threat more ominous than any shout. Steve finally found his voice. "Your Honor, there's been a terrible mistake. We were not aware of Mr. Carter's profession. If we had known, it wouldn't have mattered, Carter said, speaking for the first time since the reveal. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. The law applies to everyone, Officer Riddle. Or it's supposed to. He turned and walked toward the side door, his lawyer following. He didn't look back. Riddle watched him go, his mind a blank, screaming void. The walk out of the courthouse was a blur. He felt the eyes of the clerk, of the strangers in the hallway, on his back. His suit, which had felt like armor an hour ago, now felt like a clown costume. The world outside was too bright, the sounds of traffic too loud. He stumbled to his car, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The next few days were a special kind of hell. The story, as these things do, leaked. A cop suing a citizen was already news. A cop suing a federal prosecutor was a media sensation. Riddle was placed on administrative leave, polite way of saying he was suspended without pay while the department figured out how to cut him loose. His union rep Dave stopped returning his calls. The brotherhood of the Blue Line he had cherished his entire life suddenly felt like a ghost town. He was alone. Meanwhile, James Carter was not idle. He was back in his element, his home office, a command center for a new kind of prosecution. He wasn't just angry. He was focused. The personal insult had been the spark, but the underlying injustice was the fuel. He sat with his lawyer, a map of the coming battle spread between them. "We don't just dismiss and walk away," Carter said, his finger tapping on a legal pad. "That's what they expect. They expect me to be happy that this is over. But it's not over. This isn't about me anymore. It's about the system that allows a man like Riddle to operate with impunity." His lawyer nodded, her expression grimly determined. "So we go on the offensive. A federal civil rights lawsuit. We sue Riddle in his personal capacity, and we sue the department for failure to supervise, for creating a culture where this kind of behavior is tolerated."
Exactly.
Carter said. "I want everything. His personnel file. Every complaint that's ever been filed against him. I want the body cam footage from that day. I want the dispatch logs. I want to see the rot, and I want to expose it to the sunlight." The legal machine Carter set in motion was a thing of terrible beauty. Subpoenas were not requests. They were commands. The city's legal department, which had initially been prepared to defend Riddle's retaliatory lawsuit out of a sense of obligation, now found itself on the defensive. Facing a federal lawsuit brought by the government's own top lawyers, Riddle received the subpoena for his personnel file in the mail. It was a thick, intimidating envelope, and he felt a cold dread as he opened it. He knew what was in that file. The complaints. A dozen of them over the years, from all sorts of people. A young black man he'd roughed up during a noise complaint. A Latino woman he'd ticketed for a fabricated offense after she'd questioned him. A white teenager he'd terrorized for skateboarding in the wrong park. All of them had been dismissed by internal affairs, officially unfounded or not sustained. They were the ghosts he'd managed to keep buried, the little compromises with his conscience he'd made to get by. Now Carter was digging them up. The most devastating blow came a week later. Carter's legal team received the body cam footage from the day of the arrest. Riddle had assumed the video would show what he wanted it to show: a defiant, disrespectful citizen. He had even, in his own mind, rewritten the memory to fit that narrative. But the camera was an impartial witness. It saw everything in the quiet of his office. Carter watched the video. He saw himself pull over, calm and compliant. He saw Riddle's aggressive posture, heard the sarcastic edge in his voice. He saw his own reasonable question, "Am I under arrest?" And he saw Riddle's face contort with rage. He saw himself being shoved against the car, his hands held high, his voice saying, "I am not resisting." The video was a perfect, unassailable record of the truth. It was not just evidence. It was a verdict. The climax of this new phase of the war was the deposition. Riddle was required to appear and answer questions under oath. He walked into the sterile conference room, his lawyer beside him, and felt like he was walking to his own execution. And at the head of the table waiting for him was James Carter. He wasn't just there. He was acting as co-counsel. a move that was both legally brilliant and psychologically devastating. Riddle sat down, his mouth dry. Carter didn't look at his lawyer. He looked directly at Riddle, his gaze calm and steady. "Officer Riddle," Carter began, his voice level. "Let's start with your report. You wrote that you perceived me as a threat. Can you describe for the court what specific actions I took that made you feel threatened?" Riddle swallowed hard. Your demeanor. It was aggressive. "You were challenging my authority." "Challenging your authority," Carter repeated, making a note on his pad. "Is that what you call asking? Am I under arrest?" "The tone," Riddle said, his voice cracking. "It was the tone." Carter nodded slowly. "I see. And you also wrote in your report that I was resisting arrest. Let's watch the video." He nodded to his lawyer, who clicked a button on a laptop. The small screen came to life, showing the scene from Riddle's own body cam. The audio filled the silent room. Carter's calm voice saying, "I am not resisting." Carter paused the video. "Officer Riddle, does that sound like a man who is resisting?" Riddle stared at the frozen image of himself, his face red with anger, his hands on Carter. He was tense. He was preparing to resist. "Ow. So you arrested him for something he might do in the future?" Carter asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel now. "Is that standard procedure?" The deposition went on for hours like that. Carter was methodical, relentless. He used Riddle's own words, his own reports, his own video footage to dismantle him, piece by piece. He asked about the other complaints in his file, the ones that had been dismissed. He asked about the pattern. With every question, with every evasive answer Riddle gave, his credibility eroded further. He was no longer a police officer testifying under oath. He was a cornered man, his lies exposed to the light. He left the conference room feeling hollowed out, a shell of the man he had pretended to be. He knew with a certainty that settled into the marrow of his bones that he was not just going to lose this case. He was going to be destroyed. And the man destroying him was the same man he had so arrogantly and foolishly decided to make his enemy. The silence that followed the deposition was heavier than any testimony. Mark Riddle walked out of the sterile conference room not like a man who had lost a case, but like a man who had lost his soul. His lawyer, Steve, followed a few steps behind, his usual confident stride replaced by a shuffling gait of defeat. He didn't say a word in the elevator or on the walk to the parking garage. The silence was an accusation. Finally, beside their cars, Steve stopped. He couldn't look Riddle in the eye. He stared at a grease spot on the concrete. "Mark," he began, his voice hoarse. "It's over. We can't win this. We were never going to win this." Riddle just nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast, empty numbness. The fight had been drained out of him, leaving only a husk. "The city. The city's legal team is cutting you loose," Steve continued, his words like stones dropping into a deep well. "They saw the transcript. They saw the video. They're not going to risk a trial. They're going to settle." Riddle finally turned to look at him. "Settle. They'll pay him. A lot in your lawsuit. It's being thrown out. With prejudice, you'll likely have to pay his legal fees." The drive home was a blur. Riddle didn't remember the streets, the traffic lights, the other cars. He was moving on autopilot, his mind replaying Carter's calm, methodical destruction of his life. The man hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply held up a mirror and forced Riddle to see the ugly truth staring back. The apartment was just as he had left it that morning, but it felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. He sat on his couch, the cheap fabric groaning under his weight, stared at the wall until the room went dark. The call came 2 days later. It wasn't his union rep or his lawyer. It was from the office of the police commissioner himself. He was to report to the main headquarters the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. No excuses. The commissioner's office was on the top floor, with a sweeping view of the city Riddle had once sworn to protect. The commissioner was an older man, a career politician in a police uniform, with a face that had forgotten how to smile. He didn't offer Riddle a seat. He just stood behind his large mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "Riddle," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "We have a problem, and you are it." He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He laid out the facts like a coroner identifying a body. The federal lawsuit, the media firestorm, the impending Department of Justice investigation. The city was in damage control mode, and Riddle was the damage. "I have been advised by the city's legal counsel that we cannot and will not defend you or your actions," the commissioner said, finally looking at him. His eyes were cold, like chips of ice. "You have brought shame on this department. You have made every one of your brothers and sisters in blue look bad." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a letter of resignation. Already typed out. "You have two options," the commissioner said. "You can sign this. You resign effective immediately. You walk away. You'll lose your pension. That's non-negotiable, but you might be able to find work as a security guard somewhere. Or," he paused, letting the threat hang in the air, "you can refuse. We will fire you. We will strip you of your badge in the most public way possible. We will make sure everyone in this country knows your name, and you will never work in law enforcement again. Your choice." Riddle looked at the paper. His career, his identity, 15 years of his life reduced to a paragraph of sterile text. He thought about fighting, about screaming that it wasn't fair, that he was just doing his job, but the words wouldn't come, because he knew it was a lie. He hadn't been doing his job. He'd been acting out of pride and prejudice, and now he was paying the price, with a hand that trembled slightly. He took the pen the commissioner offered and signed his name at the bottom. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the final quiet sound of his world collapsing. The fallout was swift and public. The city settled with James Carter for a sum that was reported to be in the high seven figures. Carter held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. He didn't look angry or triumphant. He looked somber. "This was never about money," he said, the microphones buzzing in front of him. "This was about accountability. No one is above the law, especially those who are sworn to uphold it. To that end, I am donating the entire settlement to the Legal Aid Society's Police Accountability Project. This money will be used to help others who find themselves in a similar situation without the resources to defend their rights." His words were a masterstroke. They transformed him from a victim into a crusader, and they painted Riddle and the department he represented as the very problem Carter was fighting to fix. A week later, the other shoe dropped. The local news broke the story that the U.S. Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the Department of Justice, was launching a formal, wide-ranging investigation into the city police, department's internal affairs, division, and its handling of civilian complaints against officers. The press release specifically mentioned a pattern of dismissing credible complaints without thorough investigation, a direct reference to the ghosts in Riddle's personnel file that Carter had so expertly exhumed. Riddle saw the report on a small, flickering television in the break room of his new job. He was loading boxes onto a truck in a massive windowless warehouse. The work was mindless and physical, and for that, he was grateful. It left him too tired to think. His coworkers, a mix of young kids and old-timers, didn't know who he was. To them, he was just Mark, the new guy who kept to himself. He watched the news report. Seeing a file photo of himself in his uniform flash across the screen, he looked at that man with his tight, confident smile and his crisp badge and felt like he was looking at a stranger. That man was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out figure in a dusty warehouse uniform. His arrogance hadn't just cost him his job. It had cracked open the foundation of the entire institution he had dedicated his life to. He had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything that was broken. Meanwhile, in his corner office overlooking the city, James Carter put the finishing touches on a different case. The headlines had moved on, but his work had not. He looked out at the sprawling city below, a place of millions of stories, of countless interactions between the public and those sworn to protect them. He had won his battle, a fight that had been forced upon him, but he knew it was just one battle in a much larger ongoing war. He picked up a new file from his desk, opened it, and began to read. The work for him went on.